Um, then he graduated from MIT with a degree in chemical engineering in 1956. He started work with Esso Research and Engineering Company at Esso's Bayway Refinery in New Jersey. He transferred to Baton Rouge Refinery. Then he transferred to Exxon's Middle East Operations Unit in New York City. He served as Assistant General Manager of Esso Egypt from 1983 to 1986 and lived in Cairo. He took early retirement and started a second career with a small air pollution company in Naperville, Illinois. Then he took full retirement in 2000 and returned to New Jersey to live. Over the years, Jack and Carol lived in 15 different homes, much to Carol's chagrin quite a few times. So let us welcome our fellow resident, Jack Hoffman.
Oh,
Whoa,
I'm sorry about that.
that's okay. And we will get to know our neighbor. Let's welcome Jack. He's got one on him.
I thought that, is that a little too loud? They were getting feedback. Let me turn down the volume. Let me try. Is that okay now? All right. I thought that with all the news in the Middle East, that maybe there would be some interest in how, when, and why all the American and European oil companies got involved in the Middle East. And then, because I did spend some time in Egypt, I thought we could have a brief travelogue of Egypt. I'm sure some of you at least have been to Egypt, but hopefully I'll show you a couple of pictures that you might not have seen. First, I'll define what I mean by the Middle East. Basically, it's all the countries around, whoops, that's the wrong button. All the countries around the Persian Gulf, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. So that's what we're going to talk about. I'm not going to say anything about Afghanistan. I'm not going to say anything about the Arab-Israeli issues. I'm not going to say anything about politics. And I'm not going to say anything about religion. This is going to be a technical presentation. Now, in ancient times, we had Mesopotamia, and there were, I keep hitting the, I'll learn how to do this. In this area, there were oil seeps known for thousands of years, and the Baghdad, rumor has it that the Baghdad press at the time reported that Noah was using pitch from the oil seeps to caulk the ark. Now, nobody really knows whether that's true or not, but in any event, they knew that oil was around there for thousands of years. The Middle East, this chart is perhaps a little old, but I think the point here is that the reason for the interest in the Middle East is the Middle East contains roughly 50% of the world's oil reserves. So it's an area that has always been important to the oil companies, particularly in Europe and America. But actually, the oil industry didn't start in the middle. The modern oil industry didn't start in the Middle East. It started right here in Pennsylvania. Colonel Drake discovered oil at 69 feet in western Pennsylvania, Titusville, And John D. Rockefeller saw an opportunity, so he built a refinery in Cleveland in 1861, and he went on, of course, to make quite a bit of money. The next area that was important for oil development still wasn't quite in the Middle East, but it got a lot closer. This was Baku in Russia. Again, oil seeps had been known for centuries. Supposedly Marco Polo observed them in the 13th century. Russia mined oil and distributed it around the Caspian Sea in the 1800s. But around the 1870s or 1880s, Russia invited foreign capital to come in and develop the oil reserves. And they got response from Shell, Rothschilds, and most notably, Ludwig and Robert Nobel. The Nobels became the major developer in the region, and by the late 1800s, the Baku region on the Caspian Sea was the largest producer of oil in the world. In fact, it got so large that they far exceeded the demand around the Persian Gulf, around the Caspian Sea. The Caspian Sea is essentially landlocked, and the only, boy, I'm bad news with this, excuse me. The only place that there's any water coming into the Caspian Sea is the Volga River, and the market up the Volga River wasn't that great either. So they needed to get the oil over to the Black Sea in order to be able to transport it by ship to Europe. And with the help of a younger brother in Sweden named Alfred, who happened to be developing an explosive at the time, they were able to actually build a railroad and build a pipeline from Baku on the Caspian Sea over to the Black Sea, and from the Black Sea they could load it on a ship and transport it to Europe. The next area that became important was Persia. And because Persia was fairly close to the Caspian, the then Shah of Persia asked for foreign investment at a Paris exposition, and a British capitalist by the name of William Knox D'Arcy responded, and the British government and what was called Burma Oil Company supported D'Arcy, and they got a concession in Persia, and they struck oil in 1908. And soon thereafter, they became Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and then they built a refinery very shortly thereafter at Abadan, which had access to the Persian Gulf. Again, they ran into the situation where they were getting more oil than they had demand for it. So, well, this is kind of technical. This is where Abadan is, and the oil was actually discovered up here, and Abadan's down here, and then the Persian Gulf. But they had this refinery, and the refinery became the largest in the world, but they needed a market for the oil. And along came the Lord of the Admiralty at the time, who happened to be Winston Churchill, and he decreed that all British warships would henceforth be converted from coal to oil. And he committed the UK to securing a reliable source of oil. And the British government then acquired a 51% interest in Anglo-Persian, and in 1916, Anglo-Persian became British Petroleum, And British Petroleum had been a small marketing company, but Anglo-Persian bought them and actually took the name of British Petroleum. Well, yeah, that also, Anglo-Persian also became Anglo-Iranian, but it was also British Petroleum. Eventually, the Iranians built a export terminal at Karg Island, just offshore Persia, and this became the largest export terminal in the world until it was overtaken by Saudi Arabia. Iran eventually became nationalized. When Reza Shah died, he was replaced by his son. Mossadegh became the prime minister. Oil production dropped to essentially zero during Mossadegh's time. Mossadegh was overthrown. A new consortium was formed, and now finally the American companies became involved. Anglo-Iranian BP got 40%, Royal Dutch Shell 14%, and an American group got the other 40%. And the French company had 6%. And the deal was that there would be just a 50-50 profit split between the Iranian government and the oil companies. Looking around the rest of the Gulf, pre-World War I, there was the Ottoman Empire, which was basically Turkey and all the Arabian Peninsula. And a company was created called Turkish Petroleum Company. It was formed in 1912 by Royal Dutch Shell, Deutsche Bank, and Turkish National Bank. Turkish National Bank was controlled actually by some British banks and the Gulbenkian family, which they were Armenian. And the senior member of the Gulbenkian family was a gentleman named Kalust Gulbenkian. And he obtained a concession for Turkish Petroleum in Mesopotamia in 1914. Of course, World War I intervened, the Ottoman Empire collapses, and basically the deal that Gulbenkian had made collapsed. This is Kalust Gulbenkian, and there's some significance to this. He eventually became known as Mr. 5%, and I'll talk about that a little while. There was also a connection between the Gulbenkian family and Allentown, Pennsylvania. And I will also describe that as well, but we'll go through a couple of slides here. Turkish Petroleum Company renegotiated the deal, and of course the German interest was given to the French because the Germans lost the war. The U.S. opposed the agreement, and a new framework was designed and signed in 1925. They had a major discovery at an area near Kirkuk, which you may have heard of in the whole Iraq situation. Then there was a final agreement between the Shell, Anglo-Persian, the French, and an American consortium, and the Turkish Petroleum Company becomes IPC. And in giving up Turkish Petroleum Company, Kalust Gulbenkian demanded two things. One, adhere to his red line, which I'll describe, and he would take 5% of all future activities. This was his red line, which basically included Turkey and all of the Arabian Peninsula. For some reason, it excluded Kuwait, which I've never really fully understood why. But anyway, that's not really that important. But it included all the Arabian Peninsula and Turkey. Gulbenkian goes on to become the richest man in the world in the 1950s. And as I said, the Gulbenkian family had a connection to Allentown. And some of you people in this audience probably know of Dorothy Blaney. Dr. Blaney was a Jersey girl. She was born in Plainfield, New Jersey in 1941. Plainfield is right on Route 22, about 60 miles east of here. She majored in education, and she became president of Cedar Crest College in about 1989, and she was president for 17 years until she died of cancer in 2006. Well, the question is, who was she before she married Mr. Blaney? And the person she was Dorothy Gulbenkian. And she was the grand niece of Calouste. Now, I have no idea if she inherited any of the Gulbenkian money, or if she even knew Calouste personally, but she was about 15 years old when Calouste died, so she could have known him. And of course, she was in America and he was living in Europe, but she could have known him. Meanwhile, what happens in Iraq is that, well, they set up a pipeline through Israel, but they had to give that up in '48 after Israel became a country on its own. They set up a second pipeline through Syria. They also set up an export terminal on the Persian Gulf, and they eventually reached production of about 3 to 4 million barrels a day. All operations were nationalized by Saddam Hussein in 1971. Well, what happened to the other countries with the Red Line agreement that Gulbenkian had laid out? The Iraq Petroleum Company tried to get a concession in Saudi Arabia, but the then King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia demanded that payment be in solid gold. And the Iraq Petroleum Company was not willing to do that. So they never got a concession. We'll come back to Saudi Arabia in a few minutes. They did get concessions in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates and in Oman. And there were major discoveries in both Abu Dhabi, which was part of the United Arab Emirates, and in Qatar. Qatar production reaches about 1.5 million barrels per day. Abu Dhabi gets about 1 million barrels per day. Nationalization in both countries occurred starting in the period of about 1973 to 76. And initially, for the next 10 years or so, the companies continued to operate in those countries, and they would do a 50-50 profit split between the country and the companies. Just on a brief aside, because I thought some of the women might be interested in this, one of the things you find in most of these Arab countries is what is referred to as a souk, which is the local market area. And gold is sold very readily. And the interesting thing is that if you go into one of these gold stores, this one in Abu Dhabi, they sell it by weight. So it doesn't matter what you buy a bracelet or earrings or a necklace, doesn't matter what you buy, they weigh it and you pay $15 a gram or 20 or whatever the going price is. It doesn't matter what it was, how much work went into it, you just pay by the weight. And it's all 18 karat and 21 karat gold. 14 karat gold seems to be an American thing. Another one of the emirates is Dubai, and I showed this because this was a picture I took about 1980, and Dubai was pretty much just a fishing village, and there was a banking area. Dubai now is the home of the tallest building in the world. That's roughly a half a mile high, and it's become a major business center for the entire Middle East. Qatar has subsequently become a major player in natural gas. They have a huge gas field, and they're, I believe, now the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world. Kuwait becomes a player. Originally, BP and Gulf were the concessionaires. BP was not, because Kuwait was not included in the Red Line Agreement, BP didn't violate that. And they discovered oil in 1938, and they became the largest exporter of oil in the 1950s before being overtaken by Saudi Arabia. And again here, nationalization occurred in the middle 1970s. Saudi Arabia, they become the elephant in the room. SoCal was willing to give the king solid gold. And so he got the concession, SoCal got the concession in 1933. And they made a discovery in 1938, and they very soon discovered that there was more oil there than they could possibly handle themselves. So they brought Texaco in as a partner. And they continue, of course, there wasn't a lot of action during World War II, but post-World War II, Chevron and Texaco realized that there was still too much oil for them to handle. And so they brought Esso, now Exxon, and Mobil in as additional partners, and that resulted in the creation of Aramco, and the production in Saudi Arabia is roughly 10 million barrels a day, and they could probably produce more than that. They're self-limiting just to control the market. This is kind of technical, but I just wanted to show this. Over on the right-hand side of the slide is the Ghawar oil field, which turns out to be the largest in the world. It's the red part of that right-hand figure, and it's about 175 miles long. So that single oil field is about the size of the state of New Jersey. Not quite as wide, but about the same length as the state of New Jersey. And of course, this is why Saudi Arabia has so much oil. Just kind of quickly over the progression of nationalization, government started to acquire in 73. They got 60% in 74, 100% in 76. Aramco continued as the operator until 1988, when the government assumes full control and creates what became known as Saudi Aramco rather than just Aramco. Since nationalization, the kind of things that have gone on, all crude operations and have been taken over by the various countries. The private companies buy oil from the national oil companies on the open market. A number of joint ventures have been set up in the area of petrochemicals and liquefied natural gas, particularly in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait. But basically, the oil companies, the oil countries, the international oil companies, control the price of oil. And so whatever happens, they control the price. And they also control the supply. And through, particularly through OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they control the amount of oil that's produced. Just a couple of things, and these are pictures I had taken. A couple of the problems that come up when you're, one of them is blowouts, and that's a tractor right there. So you can give an idea of how big that fire is. And the other issue is, particularly in Saudi Arabia, there was associated gas that was produced during the production of the crude oil. And there was really no market for this gas, so they flared it. And those are a few of the flares. It's pretty impressive at night to fly over Saudi Arabia and see all these flares burning. At least back in the, I think they're now developing more uses for the gas, but certainly back in the 70s and 80s, all you'd see is a load of these fires going on. Well, the question then is, what have the Western companies done for the Middle East besides give them money? Is there anything else that they've given them? And the answer is, in my mind, Gulf. Every country where there was oil production, there was a golf course. And this gives you an example of that. And they have no grass, so the fairways are all sand. You carry around a little mat with you, and as long as you're in the fairway, you get to hit the ball off the mat. If you're in a sand trap, you really have to hit it out of the sand. And the greens are oiled sand. It ends up with a texture that I kind of think is somewhat similar to our bocce courts. Of course, it's brown rather than green, but the same texture as our bocce courts. And this is an actual sand trap, and of course in Saudi Arabia. And this course in Abu Dhabi, you can see they have night lights on so that they can play at night. And another example of a green. And this picture was one I took, which really shows the entire course. You can see fairways here, and the various greens. It's kind of an interesting game. I mean, anyway, doing okay on time here. So I thought golf would be a good transition to Egypt. Now that may seem strange, but I hope that I'll clarify that. Egypt has never been a major player. They did export some oil, but they've never been a major player. There was a concession that they gave to Amoco many years ago, and Exxon had a concession for a while. But they've always had substantial internal demand. I mean, Egypt has 50 or 60 million people, so they've had a significant internal demand. So there actually wasn't that much available for export. And of course, as everybody knows, Egypt is much more noted for tourism than it is for oil production. Now, I'm sure anybody that sees a picture of Egypt, this is one of the first pictures you see, the pyramids. And one of the questions you think, well, these pyramids must be out in the middle of the desert somewhere. And if you're a tourist, the kind of picture you see is that one. Again, in the desert. I don't know whether anybody recognizes it, but that's Jill Sperry right there. I told the other kids that I would also make sure that their pictures got into this presentation. But my point is that you really think that you're in the desert. In fact, you're not in the desert, because right on the other side of the pyramid is a golf course. And I don't know how many people that actually visit Egypt ever get to see the golf course. But it's right there, right next to the pyramids. And if you take a overhead view of the pyramids, you can see they are actually very close to the city. And there's the golf course right there. In fact, if you fly over Egypt at a fairly high altitude, Egypt is basically a desert. And what you see is just a green line going right down the country. Of course, up here is the Nile Delta, but the river, the Nile, goes down here, and from the air you can actually see a green line going down through the country. And I've made a note here of the places where you're going to see a few pictures. Arish on the Arish on the Mediterranean, and of course the Suez Canal, Cairo, Saqqara, which is just south of Cairo, and then going down the river, we've got Luxor, Aswan, and Abu Simbel. These are the typical places that tourists are going to visit when they're in Egypt. This is the island of Zamalek, which is located right in the middle of the Nile River, and it has the other golf course in Cairo, at least the other golf course in the 1980s. The golf course is right there, and the apartment we lived in was right there. And this was a view of the golf course from our apartment. So it was a pretty nice place to live. Now, Egypt gets virtually no rain, and you think of this as probably a hazy day, but the humidity is always extremely low. And in fact, that isn't haze, it's very fine sand. And depending upon which direction the wind is blowing in, you get this fine sand in the air, and man, you got to keep all your windows closed, or everything in your house will be just covered with dust. I don't recall exactly how frequently that occurred, but it did occur enough that it could create a problem at times. Looking around at some of the other scenic attractions that you're going to see if you go to Cairo, one of course is the Sphinx, which is right out by the pyramids. In Cairo, it's very pleasant to ride around the river on what they call a felucca, little sailboat. And this hotel right here is the Cairo Hilton, Nile. I guess they call it the Nile Hilton. I think this hotel may have been in one of Agatha Christie's books. it's a pretty old hotel. And this is a view looking south along the Nile from what's called the Cairo Tower. Again, it's a good place to visit if you're there because you do get a very good overview of the entire city. This is the British Museum. Well, the Cairo Museum was British, now the Cairo Museum. And it again is a place where you want to visit because a lot of the antiquities are stored in the Cairo Museum. The hotel in the background there is, this one is the Ramses Hilton. Another place that is worth visiting in Cairo is the local souk, which is called Khan El Khalili. This is an area, I would guess maybe there's 100 shops, all run by individual families, all kinds of local products, carpets, copper pots, baskets, jewelry, just about anything somebody can make, you can find in Khan Khalili. The interesting thing there is that everything is negotiated. There basically are no established prices for anything. Everything you buy there, you negotiate. And they start the shop owner will start his child negotiating when they're 6 or 7 years old. So you'll go into a shop and you'll be negotiating with an 8 or 9-year-old. And they're good. They're very good. I mean, they learn how to negotiate at a very early age. So, and that's not unique to Egypt. I mean, it's true in Saudi Arabia and it's true in Iran. I mean, they start these kids out at a very young age and they're very good negotiators. Another thing that Cairo is famous for is traffic. I didn't take this picture, but I liked it because at one time I asked my driver, how many lanes are there in this road? And he said, well, that's very simple. He said, as many cars as can fit next to each other. This was a picture I took, and in this case, this road actually is two-way traffic. I mean, the traffic on the left is coming away from us, and the traffic on the right is coming towards us. Now, not too far out of Cairo, you also find animal life. Not unusual is to come across a herd of goats. And in the city, there are quite a few, at least again during the 1980s, there were a lot of donkey carts. Another hazard that you could run into, butcher shops. Because of limited refrigeration, butcher shops were only open 2 days a week. And the butchers would just hang their products outside the shop, and people would just come along and park and pick out whatever they wanted to buy. And of course, that again created additional traffic on the road. And finally, camels. I mean, what would Egypt be without camels? That actually is a camel that I took that picture from my car. There is a camel underneath that load. I always like this picture because this camel just looks very smug to me. And I guess he is better at holding his water than most of us are. But I just thought it was kind of a neat picture. A little bit more of the scenic attractions. Just south of Cairo is in a town called Saqqara, is the oldest standing pyramid in Egypt, dating to roughly 2660 BC. So we're talking about something that's almost 4,700 years old. And it's kind of mind-boggling when you go around Egypt to see these things that are literally thousands of years old, and they're still standing and they're still in pretty good shape. If you go east of Cairo, of course, you come to the Suez Canal, and this was one of the pictures I took, and I guess what I thought about this is it's fairly easy to see how if one of these ships gets turned sideways, it will block the canal. And of course, that's what just happened, a few months ago. And further east on the Mediterranean is a resort area called Arish. It's on the Sinai Peninsula on the Mediterranean. And I'm not sure exactly what the time frame of this picture was. I mean, the part of the year it was. But it's not unusual to see no people on the beach. I mean, the Egyptians, and I guess the Arabs in general, don't use beaches the way you would find on the Jersey Shore. Part of that may be the fact that women have to wear pretty extensive clothing when they're on the beach. But this is not unusual to have a beach like this and no people on it.
What was that?
Hmm?
What was that?
That's my wife. Well, going south, of course, the next major area you come to is Luxor. And it is so vast that I really don't have the ability to take a picture that would show all the temples and statues. But the one guy you're going to see frequently is Ramses II. Ramses II ruled Egypt for about 65 years. He took over when he was about 15 or 20 years old, and he lived to be 85. So he was the longest ruler of Egypt, and it happened during a period when they were prospering, so he became very wealthy and built all these temples and statues. Another one that's in Luxor, actually on the east, the west side of the river, is the temple of Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut is unique because she was a woman, and she was a woman pharaoh because her husband died when her son, the heir, was only 2 years old. So she became a regent pharaoh, and I think went on for about 20 years until her son got to be old enough to become pharaoh himself. And she became quite famous, and I guess was a pretty successful pharaoh or pharaohess, and they ended up building a very nice temple for her. More of the kind of statues you see around there, they're just huge. I mean, and again, you're thinking about something that's 3,000 to 4,000 years old. And some of them are a little bit defaced, but I mean, they're still in pretty good condition. And you just see these things all over. As I said, it's so vast around Luxor that impossible, at least for me, to capture it all on camera. This is another statue of Ramses, and the significance of this is that this statue here is his wife. And I think it sort of reflects the position of women compared to the men at that time in Egypt. Actually, I made a typographical error here. This should be the west side of the Nile. And you see these hills back here. The Valley of the Kings is located right behind those hills. And that's where Tutankhamun's tomb is and a lot of other tombs. And in going through this, I couldn't find any pictures. And I think the reason for that is that when we visited those tombs, we were not allowed to take pictures. So, unfortunately, I didn't get any pictures of Tutankhamun's tomb or any of the other tombs. But it is a very nice area. Going further south, you come to what's called the Aswan High Dam. This was built in, I guess, late 1960s. And you think of a high dam in America that, like Hoover Dam or Boulder Dam, that's going to be 300 or 400, 500 feet high. The high dam here is probably something that's less than 50 feet high. And it's just an earthen dam. But it did manage to control the river, and it controlled the river, everything downstream of that, so that they didn't get these annual floods that they were getting prior to this dam. That's another. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Excuse me. Aswan, I would say, was the first area in Egypt that we visited where you look out and you say, I could be in America. I mean, it's just the whole atmosphere around here. The water was clean. There were a lot of rocks that you didn't see further north. And just the whole area, the sailboats on the water, just the whole area just gave me the impression that this was a lot more like America. But there still are a lot of old temples and statues around. I don't know whether you can see it here, but this was some graffiti that we saw, and dated 1823. I don't know how real that is, but at least our guide says that those dates are good. That's when that graffiti was originally carved. Now, the final place that we visited is Abu Simbel. And this is a statue that's carved into the mountain. The interesting thing about Abu Simbel is that when they created the high dam, these statues were located at a lower level, and they were going to be flooded as Lake Nasser rose. So they had to take them all apart and rebuild them higher up on the side of the hill. And you'll see in subsequent slides here how really large these statues are. These are all Ramses II. All four of them are all Ramses II. Some of them have had some destruction. I think there's particularly this one lost his head. But they're in remarkably good condition. And particularly for the fact that they were literally taken apart and rebuilt at a higher elevation. And to get an impression as to how large these really are, that's my wife standing by one of the legs of one of those statues. They're huge. I haven't shown many pictures of people, but I wanted you to see what a typical Egyptian family might look like. This happened to be my driver and his wife and his 5 children. They were just lovely people, and my driver spoke enough English that we never had a problem communicating. This is a working class family. I mean, this is not the elite. This is just a typical working class people, how they dressed, but really a delightful family. And the final slide really has nothing to do with anything I've talked about. But I just like the picture as a picture. This is a gun shop in Oman, and you can see they're carrying daggers and guns, and I just thought, wow, do I need to have a background check to get a gun here? But anyway, that's all I had planned, so I'd throw it open for questions if somebody has a question. Ted?
Oh, are we on? Can you hear me? Oh, they're shaking their heads. Okay. I was going to ask you about golf in Cairo. Did they have green grass fairways and
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
and the greens?
I mentioned. I meant to really mention that. I mean, that they have caddies. They actually have caddies. They don't have golf carts. They use caddies.
Did you play golf?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Thank you.
You can see here that the fairways are green in Egypt, and the greens are green. Egypt has the advantage of being on the Nile, or Cairo has the advantage of being right on the Nile River, where they can pump water out of the river and water the fairways. Cairo gets about 1 inch of rain per year. So they don't get enough rain to support this, but they can pump water out of the river and water the fairways and water the greens. So yes, those fairways are all green. And this golf course, as I mentioned, was right across the street from where I live. So I did play golf there fairly often.
Jack, they have so much oil, they don't have a problem for fuel, but what are they going to do for water? Are they doing much desalination?
They do a lot of desalination, a lot of it.
So maybe we could ship them water and get the oil in exchange.
Maybe some of that is done, Don. I don't know. I mean, but they have a lot of desalination plants.
Yes, you do.
Source of the Nile.
What is the
It-
source of the Nile?
It goes down through the Sudan and I think into Ethiopia. There are, I think there's called the Red Nile and one other, maybe the Green Nile, but it's down into Ethiopia where the Nile really starts.
It's one of the longest rivers in the world.
Yes, yeah.
Anybody else?
Jack, what's the meat that they sell in the butcher shops that were strung up there?
I would say it's a lot of sheep and goats. Beef was more difficult to acquire. There is some, but it's more difficult to acquire.